There are moments in life when you realize a person isn't just making a mistake. They're showing you exactly who they are. For me, that moment came on a Tuesday afternoon when I pulled into my driveway and discovered half my fence had vanished. Not damaged, not knocked over by a storm. Gone. And standing where that fence used to be was a massive construction truck, parked halfway across my backyard like it had every right in the world to be there. I remember sitting in my truck for a second, staring through the windshield, genuinely wondering if I was looking at the wrong house. You know that feeling when something is so absurd your brain refuses to process it right away? That was me. My name is Ethan Walker, and at the time all of this happened, I had been living in the same neighborhood outside Columbus, Ohio, for almost 10 years. It wasn't one of those fancy subdivisions with giant gates and country club memberships. Just a quiet middle-class neighborhood where people waved when they passed each other and generally respected where their property ended and someone else's began. At least that's how it used to be. My house sat at the edge of a corner lot. Nothing special. Small backyard. Detached shed. Enough room to store equipment for my landscaping business. I spent years building that business from the ground up. Early mornings, 12-hour days, weekends when everyone else was at barbecues and I was trimming hedges in 90-degree heat. Everything in that backyard represented work. The trailer, the tools, the equipment, the property itself. Every square foot meant something to me because I had paid for every inch of it. The fence running along the side yard had been there since before I bought the house. Old cedar boards, weathered gray. Not exactly beautiful, but solid. Reliable. It did what fences are supposed to do. It marked a boundary. For nearly a decade, nobody touched it. Then the house next door sold. Now, every neighborhood eventually gets one person who changes the atmosphere the second they arrive. You know the type. They don't move into a community. They arrive like they're taking ownership of it. In my case, that person was a guy named Grant Mercer. The moving trucks hadn't even finished unloading before construction crews started showing up. Within days, his property looked like a demolition site. Roof coming off, garage torn apart, new driveway being poured, contractors everywhere. At first I didn't care. His house, his money, his business. If somebody wants to spend a fortune turning their place into a miniature mansion, that's their decision. But then little things started happening. One morning, I noticed tire tracks near the edge of my grass. Another day, a stack of lumber got dropped a little too close to my property line. Then, one of his contractors parked partially across my driveway. Nothing major. Nothing worth starting a war over. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Looking back now, I realized those weren't isolated incidents. They were tests. Small little pushes to see where the line actually was. And every time nobody pushed back, they got a little bolder. The real problem was Grant's driveway. Whoever designed that property decades ago clearly wasn't thinking about modern construction vehicles. The entrance was narrow and awkward. Large trucks struggled to make the turn. Most homeowners would adjust. Schedule smaller deliveries. Use different equipment. Find another solution. Grant had a different idea. He decided my yard was the solution. The afternoon I found the missing fence, I walked straight toward him. He was standing near the truck talking to a contractor, completely relaxed, hands in his pockets like everything happening around him was perfectly normal. I pointed at the opening where my fence used to be. "Grant, what happened to my fence?" He barely even looked. The contractor answered first. "We had to remove a few panels." Remove. I remember that word sticking in my head. Not ask. Not borrow. Not discuss. Remove. Grant finally turned toward me and shrugged. Truck needed room to swing in. That was it. No apology. No warning. No explanation. Just a shrug. I stared at him for a second. "You removed my fence." Again, that shrug. "We'll put it back when construction's done." I don't know why, but something about the casual way he said it bothered me more than the missing fence itself. Because in his mind, this wasn't my property. It was simply space he wasn't using. Space he felt entitled to. I told him that wasn't happening. I told him the fence sat on my property. I told him nobody had permission to remove anything. And that's when he smiled. Not an angry smile. Not a threatening smile. The kind of smile people give when they've already decided your opinion doesn't matter. "Relax, Ethan," he said. It's temporary. Then he turned around and walked away while another truck rolled straight across my grass. And standing there, watching muddy tires carve fresh tracks through my yard, I had a feeling this situation was about to become a whole lot bigger than a fence. The next morning, I woke up hoping maybe I'd overreacted. Maybe Grant had talked to the contractors. Maybe somebody would start putting the fence back. Maybe common sense had finally entered the conversation. Instead, I looked out my kitchen window and watched another truck drive through the opening. Then another. Then another. By Friday, my backyard looked less like a lawn and more like a temporary access road. The grass near the property line was gone. Deep tire ruts cut through the soil. Every delivery truck seemed to follow the exact same path, entering through the gap where my fence used to be, as if that route had always existed. What bothered me most wasn't even the damage. It was how normal everyone treated it. The drivers didn't hesitate. The contractors didn't ask questions. Nobody acted like they were crossing onto someone else's land. They simply followed the route they had been given. And every time I saw it happen, I found myself getting angrier. Not explosive anger. The slow kind. The kind that builds quietly. The kind that sits in the back of your mind while you're eating dinner. While you're trying to sleep. While you're pretending you're not thinking about it. A couple days later, I was talking with my friend Mike, who owned a hardware store about 20 minutes away. I told him what was happening. He laughed. Not because it was funny. Because he couldn't believe it. Wait, he said. You're telling me this guy tore down your fence without permission and now uses your yard as a driveway? Pretty much. Mike shook his head. That's not a misunderstanding, Ethan. That's a guy who thinks rules are for other people. That sentence stayed with me. Because the more I watched Grant, the more it fit. He wasn't acting like somebody asking for temporary help. He was acting like somebody exercising authority. And once I saw it that way, other things started making sense. The constant dismissive attitude. The confidence. The complete lack of concern. Grant genuinely believed his project was more important than anyone else's rights. A few days later, I tried one last conversation. Not because I thought it would work. Because I wanted to know for sure. I caught him outside while contractors were unloading lumber. Grant, we need to settle this fence situation. He sighed immediately. That annoyed sigh people make when they feel inconvenienced. What now? I pointed toward the tire tracks. My property is getting destroyed. He looked at the yard, then looked back at me. It's just grass. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, because I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It's just grass. Come on, Ethan. The construction will be finished eventually. Eventually. There was that word again. The magical word people use when they want you to tolerate something indefinitely. I remember crossing my arms and looking directly at him. When exactly? What? When exactly is eventually? For the first time, he didn't have an answer. His expression tightened. The smile disappeared. And that's when the conversation changed. He took a step closer. Not aggressively. Just enough to communicate something. You know, he said, most neighbors would be a little more cooperative. There it was. The real message. Not a request. Not a compromise. An expectation. Cooperate. Accept it. Stay quiet. Make my life easier. I looked at him and said something I'll never forget. Most neighbors would have asked first. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then he gave that same irritating smile. The one that said he thought the discussion was over. Relax. It'll all work out. And once again, he walked away. That was the moment everything changed. Not because of what he said, because of what I finally understood. Grant wasn't going to stop. Not voluntarily. Every conversation reinforced that reality. Every truck crossing my yard reinforced it. Every muddy tire track reinforced it. The problem wasn't communication anymore. The problem was consequences. That week in the neighborhood finally got quiet. No deliveries. No contractors. No machinery. Just the normal sounds of people mowing lawns and kids riding bicycles. Saturday morning, I grabbed a cup of coffee, sat in my backyard, and stared at the gap where the fence used to be. For nearly an hour. Thinking. Planning. Visualizing. I wasn't interested in revenge. Revenge is emotional. What I wanted was clarity. A clear boundary. A solution nobody could misinterpret. And then an idea hit me. Actually, that's not true. The idea had been sitting in the back of my head for days. I just finally admitted I was going to do it. By noon, I was at a commercial fencing supplier across town. The salesman showed me decorative panels, privacy fencing, traditional options. I wasn't interested. Then I saw something else. Heavy gauge, galvanized steel livestock panels. Industrial grade. Simple. Extremely durable. The kind of barrier built to withstand abuse. I remember running my hand across one panel and smiling. The salesman looked at me. What are you planning to keep out? I laughed. One very specific neighbor. By Sunday afternoon, my project was underway. I hired a surveyor first. That part mattered. I wanted zero ambiguity. No disputes. No arguments. No accusations. The surveyor marked every inch of the property line with bright orange stakes. When he finished, I asked him to verify it twice. He probably thought I was crazy. I didn't care, because if Grant challenged anything later, I wanted facts on my side. Then came the fence. Steel posts sunk deep into the ground. Concrete footings. Heavy metal panels secured from end to end. No weakest spots. No removable sections. No circuits. The work took all weekend. By sunset Sunday evening, I stood back and admired it. It wasn't pretty. Nobody was going to feature it in a home improvement magazine. But it was strong. More importantly, it was final. The path through my yard was gone. Completely gone. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. Peace. Monday morning arrived. And right on schedule, the first truck came down the street. I happened to be outside drinking coffee when it happened. The driver slowed, turned toward the opening he expected to see, then slammed on the brakes. I nearly spit out my coffee. The confusion on his face was priceless. He pulled forward, backed up, tried another angle. Nothing. The fence wasn't moving. A second truck arrived behind him, then a third. Within 15 minutes, half the street looked like a traffic jam designed by somebody who hated construction workers. Drivers climbed out. Contractors started pointing. People were talking. Nobody seemed to understand why their shortcut had suddenly disappeared. Then Grant stepped outside, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Because that's the exact moment reality finally introduced itself. At first he looked confused, then concerned, then angry. His eyes locked onto the new fence, then onto me, standing calmly in my yard with a coffee mug in my hand. And the second our eyes met, I knew he was coming over. Fast, very fast. He marched across his lawn and stopped right at the property line. What the hell is this? I looked at the fence, then looked at him. Oh, that's my new fence. His jaw tightened. The trucks can't get through. I took another sip of coffee. Yeah. He stared at me, waiting, expecting more. But I was done explaining. Finally, he pointed toward his driveway. They can't make the turn. And that's when I gave him the same level of concern he'd shown me for weeks. I shrugged. Sounds like a problem on your property. For a moment, he looked completely stunned, like he genuinely couldn't believe someone had returned his own logic back to him. Then behind him, another truck started honking. And another. The entire street was backing up. Contractors were gathering. Drivers were getting frustrated. The shortcut was gone. And for the first time since moving into the neighborhood, Grant Mercer had run into a boundary he couldn't simply ignore. The rest of that day was an absolute disaster for Grant. Not because anybody was yelling. Not because there was some dramatic showdown in the street. Actually, it was almost the opposite. Reality did all the work for me. The trucks couldn't use my yard anymore, which meant every piece of lumber, every pallet of bricks, every bag of concrete suddenly had to come through the front the hard way. I watched crews spend hours doing work that used to take minutes. Materials got unloaded at the curb. Workers carried everything by hand. Equipment had to be repositioned. Schedules started slipping. And every delay cost money. Lots of it. You could feel the mood changing by the hour. The contractors were frustrated. The drivers were frustrated. Even the guys working on the house looked exhausted. Meanwhile, I went back to my normal life. I mowed my lawn, took care of clients, worked in the yard. The fence stayed exactly where it was. Solid, silent, unmovable. And that's what made it so effective. It wasn't attacking anyone. It wasn't arguing. It wasn't demanding anything. It simply existed. A fact. A boundary. A reminder. 2 days later, just after dinner, there was a knock on my door. I already knew who it was. When I opened the door, Grant looked different. Not defeated. Not exactly, but humbled. The confidence that had surrounded him for weeks was gone. His shoulders sat lower. His voice was calmer. For the first time since he moved in, he looked like a neighbor instead of a man trying to run the neighborhood. "Hey," he said quietly. I nodded. "Hey." For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he finally took a breath. "I think we got off on the wrong foot." I almost smiled. Not because it wasn't true, because it was probably the biggest understatement I'd heard all year. Grant rubbed the back of his neck. "The project is getting complicated." I didn't say anything. He continued. "The delays are costing me a lot." Still nothing. Then he finally got to the point. "I'll pay for the fence." I raised an eyebrow. "The old fence." He nodded. "And the damage to your yard." I waited. "There won't be any more trucks crossing your property." There it was. The sentence I should have heard on day one. Not after weeks of damage. Not after thousands of dollars in delays. Day one. Funny how expensive lessons tend to stick better. I looked past him toward his house. Workers were still moving equipment. The project was still going. Life was still moving forward. And honestly, I wasn't interested in dragging things out. A lot of people think victory means making the other person suffer. I don't. Victory is getting the problem solved. Nothing more. Nothing less. So I nodded. "That works." The relief on his face was immediate. Like he'd been carrying a weight he didn't want to admit existed. We shook hands. Not because we suddenly became friends. Because the issue was over. At least officially. Over the following weeks, the construction continued. Slower than before. More expensive than before. But it continued. The crews adapted. The deliveries adapted. And eventually the renovation was finished. The funny thing is, once Grant couldn't use my property anymore, he somehow managed to solve every logistical problem he'd claimed was impossible to solve. Amazing how that works. A few months later, fresh grass had grown back where the tire tracks used to be. The yard healed. The neighborhood settled down. Life returned to normal. Or at least mostly normal. Every now and then I'd catch Grant looking at that fence. Not angrily. Almost thoughtfully. Like it represented something bigger than steel posts and metal panels. Maybe it did. Because looking back, this story was never really about a fence. The fence was just the physical version of a much larger problem. Boundaries. That's what this was always about. And the truth is, most boundary problems don't start with huge confrontations. They start with tiny exceptions, a small favor, a temporary inconvenience, a harmless little shortcut, something that doesn't seem worth arguing about. Until one day, you realize the exception became the rule. I've seen it happen with neighbors, friends, family members, even businesses. People slowly expand into whatever space they're allowed to occupy. Not always because they're bad people. Sometimes because they're human. Convenience has a way of rewriting standards if nobody pushes back. And that's why I think so many people related to this story when I first told it. Because almost everyone has had a Grant in their life. Maybe not a neighbor. Maybe a coworker. Maybe a relative. Maybe someone who kept asking for one more favor, one more exception, one more compromise until you barely recognized where your own limits used to be. The hardest part isn't setting the boundary. The hardest part is setting it before resentment takes over. Before frustration turns into anger. Before the situation becomes personal. I probably waited longer than I should have. Maybe some people watching would say I should have called an attorney immediately. Others would say I should have involved the city. Some would argue I should have escalated much sooner. Maybe they're right. Maybe they're not. That's actually something I've gone back and forth on over the years. Why to know is this? The moment that fence went up, the argument ended. Not because anybody won. Because reality became impossible to debate. The line was visible, clear, undeniable. And sometimes that's all a boundary needs to be. Now here's the question I still think about. What would have happened if I'd done nothing? If I'd accepted the temporary arrangement? If I kept waiting for Grant to do the right thing on his own? Would the fence ever have come back? Would the trucks still be crossing my yard? Honestly, I don't know. And that's why I'm curious what you think. If you were in my position, what would have been your move? Would you have called the police? Contacted the city? Taken him to court? Or would you have done exactly what I did and let a brand new fence do all the talking? Drop your thoughts in the comments because I read way more of them than people think, and trust me, some of the best debates happen down there. If you've ever dealt with a neighbor, coworker, HOA board member, or anybody else who treated your boundaries like optional suggestions. Share your story too. And if you enjoyed this one, hit that like button, subscribe, and stick around, because in every neighborhood, behind every perfectly trimmed lawn and freshly painted fence, there's usually a story nobody sees coming.